The auctioneer's voice cut through the dry Kansas air like a blade, and Anna Pritchard felt the world tilt beneath her boots. She was standing at the edge of the crowd gathered outside the Hayes City Land Registry office, her sun-cracked hands pressed flat against the rough wooden fence post, as if the post alone could keep her upright. The August heat of 1874 pressed down on everything like a wet blanket, and the dust that rose from the boots of 30 assembled men coated her throat and her eyes and her grief equally. She had not slept in 3 nights. She had not eaten more than a handful of dried biscuits since Thursday, and now she was watching strangers bid on pieces of her future. "Lot 17, the auctioneer called out, mopping sweat from his wide forehead with a yellowed kerchief. 240 acres of prime Wallace land, running east along the Smoky Hill River. Surveyed, clear title, no liens. Who'll open at $300, Wallace land." The name hit her like a stone between the eyes. Anna turned from the fence, her stomach dropping through the earth, and she pushed through the crowd with her elbows sharp and her jaw set until she could see the front clearly. Until she could see the register ledger being held open on the folding table and the neat, deliberate signature at the top of the auction consent form. Amos Wallace. She knew that signature. She had seen it twice before. Once on the deed of land transfer that had given her father the southern parcel of his wheat farm when he first arrived in Kansas from Ohio in 1861, and once on a note that had been passed beneath her back door 3 weeks ago, the morning after the bank manager had delivered the worst news of her life, a note that said only, "Don't worry, it will be handled." She had not understood what that note meant until this exact moment. Her throat closed entirely. Amos was auctioning half his land, half of the Wallace spread. The western 240 acres along the river, the most fertile soil he owned, the parcel his father had broken his back building, the land that had been in the Wallace family since before Kansas was even a state. And he was doing it in secret. He had not come to her. He had not asked her permission or offered her his charity or given her the chance to refuse. He had simply, quietly, at enormous personal cost, arranged to save her farm. And he had never said a single word about it. Anna's eyes swept the crowd desperately, searching every weathered face, every battered hat, every pair of shoulders bent against the noon heat. Amos Wallace was nowhere to be seen. The first bid rang out at $320, and Anna pressed her hand over her mouth, because if she opened it, she was not entirely sure she would not scream. 3 months earlier, the world had been different. Not easy, because nothing in Ellis County in the summer of 1874 was easy, but different in the way that bearable things differ from the unbearable. Anna had been running the Pritchard farm alone since her father, Daniel Pritchard, had fallen from the hayloft in early May and broken 2 ribs, and his left wrist badly enough that Dr. Horace Finley had told him firmly that he was to do nothing more strenuous than lift a spoon until September at the earliest. Anna had grown up working that land. She could drive a mule team, red weather, grade wheat, negotiate at the grain elevator in town, and fix a fence line in the dark if she had to. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of hard-won prairie competence, with brown hair that she kept pinned severely back because loose hair and farm machinery did not make good companions, and brown eyes that her father said looked like the bottom of the Smoky Hill on a clear day, all depth and quiet motion. She had never had time to think much about romance. There had been 2 men who had expressed interest over the years, a traveling dry goods merchant from Abilene who had been agreeable enough but had the restless eyes of a man who would never stay put, and a farmer's son from the next county over who had been kind, but 20 years her senior and more interested in her father's land than in her. She had thanked both of them politely and returned to work. Amos Wallace was a different kind of problem entirely. He owned the Wallace spread, which ran adjacent to the northern boundary of the Pritchard farm. It was a large operation, nearly 600 acres total in 1874, worked by Amos and two permanent hired hands named Gil Burrows and Pete Crane, with additional seasonal labor during wheat harvest. Amos had inherited it from his father, Caleb Wallace, who had died of a lung fever in the winter of 1871, when Amos was 29. He was 32 now, tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors year-round, with dark eyes and a deliberate manner that some people in Hays City read as coldness, and that Anna had always privately suspected was something else entirely. They had been neighbors their entire lives, more or less. The Pritchards and the Wallaces had shared a fence line for 13 years. They had helped each other with harvests, loaned equipment, passed warnings about bad weather and flooding creeks. But the help had always been practical and transactional in the way that prairie neighbors' help tends to be, rooted in mutual necessity rather than sentiment. What had changed between them had changed slowly, and then all at once. It had started with a fence dispute in the spring of 1873 that turned out not to be a dispute at all. Anna had gone to the Wallace property to confront Amos about a section of shared fencing that had been moved 6 feet onto Pritchard land, which she had discovered while doing a property walk in March. She had arrived ready for an argument, had found Amos already at the fence line with a post-hole digger, and had opened her mouth to speak before he held up one hand and said calmly that he had found the error himself that morning and was correcting it, and that he was sorry for the encroachment, which had happened because his hired hand Pete had misread the original survey markers. Anna had stood there with her argument dissolved entirely and nothing to say. Amos had looked at her then with those dark, unhurried eyes and said, "You were ready for a fight, Miss Pritchard." "I was prepared for a conversation," she had said, which was technically accurate. "Same thing in my experience," he had said, and gone back to digging. She had stood there another moment, watching the efficient, deliberate motion of his arms, and then she had said, because she was honest above all things, "Thank you for fixing it." He had nodded without looking up, and she had walked back to her own land. And that night she had sat on her back porch watching the stars come out over the prairie and felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately identify. They had spoken more after that. Not dramatically, not with any great declaration or sudden revelation, but in the natural, accumulating way of two people who discover that the other person's mind is interesting. He had come to her fence line one evening in July 1873 to tell her that a flash flood had taken out the bridge on the South Trail, and she should plan to use the North Road for the next week. She had thanked him and offered him coffee, which she had been drinking on the porch. He had accepted, and they had talked for an hour about the poor wheat prices that year and the railroad expansion, and whether Hays City was growing faster than its infrastructure could sensibly support. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence. When Amos Wallace said something, it meant something, and Anna found that restful in a way she had not expected. She was surrounded by men who talked too much and too loudly, the cattle buyers who came through, the merchants in town, the neighboring farmers who gathered at the feed store to complain about everything from rainfall to the price of nails. Amos was different. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he was precise. She noticed other things too, in that quiet way that is worse than dramatic attraction because it has no clear beginning and no clean edge. She noticed that he always replaced borrowed tools in better condition than he had borrowed them. She noticed that he treated his hired men, Gil and Pete, with consistent fairness, giving them Sunday afternoons and paying them on time regardless of the harvest's quality. She noticed that when a widow woman named Clara Marsh, who lived on a small farm 2 miles north, had a bad winter and ran short of firewood, Amos had a cord of wood delivered to her without being asked, and without making any mention of it in company. She noticed all of this, and she kept it to herself the way you keep things that are precious and uncertain, close to the chest, in the dark. Her father Daniel had noticed something too. He was a quiet, observant man who had known grief, having lost Anna's mother to typhoid fever when Anna was 8 years old, and who had the particular patience of a person who has learned that the most important things cannot be forced. He had said to Anna one evening in the early fall of 1873, completely without preamble, "Amos Wallace is a good man." Anna had said, "Yes, I believe he is." Her father had said nothing further, and they had both sat with the fire and the silence, and the subject had not been raised again, but it had sat between them like a warm stone, and Anna had felt it there every time Amos Wallace's name came up after that. What she did not know, what she could not have known in those slow and accumulating months, was that Amos was carrying something heavy. His father, Caleb Wallace, had not been an entirely honest man. This was the secret that Amos had lived with since the winter of 1871, the dark knowledge that had come to him with the reading of his father's papers after the funeral, hidden in a locked tin box at the bottom of a trunk of old correspondence. Caleb Wallace had borrowed money from a Hayes City businessman named Gerald Stein in 1869, a sum of $400 against the security of the western 240 acres of the Wallace property. He had borrowed it at a punishing interest rate, had made only partial repayments, and by the time of his death had left a debt of $612 outstanding. The loan had been legally binding. The terms had been predatory but had been agreed to in writing, and the document had been notarized. Gerald Stein had not pressed the claim immediately after Caleb's death, but he had let Amos know, through a letter delivered by his lawyer, that the debt existed and would be collected. Amos had spent 2 years working quietly to reduce that debt, paying Stein every spare dollar he generated above his operating costs, selling cattle when the prices were reasonable, cutting his own expenses to the bone. He had told no one, not Gil or Pete, not any neighbor, not the minister at the small Methodist church in town. He had carried it privately, the way he carried most things, with a jaw set against the weight of it. By the spring of 1874, he had the debt down to $340. He was close. He could see the end of it. And then 2 things happened in rapid succession that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Daniel Pritchard fell from the hayloft. The second was that the Hayes City First National Bank, which held the mortgage on the Pritchard farm, was bought out by a consortium of investors from St. Louis who had no patience for small farmers, no interest in the complexity of individual circumstances, and an absolute determination to either collect their debts in full or foreclose on the properties securing them. The notice had come to Anna in late May. She had 60 days to clear an outstanding balance of $285 on the farm mortgage, or the bank's new owners would foreclose and auction the property. $285. For a working farm in Ellis County in 1874, with a disabled farmer and a single woman running operations, in a year with uncertain wheat prices, it was an impossible sum. It might as well have been $2,000. Anna had gone through every resource she had, every dollar saved, every asset that could be liquidated. She had sold the extra mule. She had sold her mother's silver hairbrush set, the only jewelry she owned. She had spoken to the grain elevator manager about an advance against the fall harvest, and he had been sympathetic but unable to give her more than $120 in credit without collateral she didn't have. She was still $165 short. She had written to her only living relative outside Kansas, a cousin in Cincinnati named Robert Hale, explaining the situation and asking for a loan. She had not heard back. She would not hear back. Robert Hale was a decent man in ordinary circumstances, but had 4 children and a small shop that was barely profitable. And a letter asking for $165 was the kind of letter that a decent man in ordinary circumstances might put in a drawer and not answer. She had told almost no one about the bank notice. She had told her father, who had gone white and quiet with it, and who had asked her twice if she was sure there was no other way, and then had stopped asking because Daniel Pritchard knew his daughter and knew that if she said she had exhausted her options, She had exhausted them thoroughly. She had told no one else, because pride was not a small thing on the Kansas prairie, and because the knowledge that the Pritchard farm might be lost would travel through the community like fire through dry grass, and she could not bear the pity of it. Amos had found out from an entirely different direction. It was his hired hand, Gil Burrows, who had heard something. A piece of overheard conversation between the bank manager and his clerk at the general store. Something specific enough that Gil had mentioned it to Amos one evening without understanding its full significance, only saying that it sounded like the Pritchard place might be in some trouble with the new bank ownership. Amos had gone very still in a way that Gil recognized as meaning he was thinking hard about something, and had asked one careful question about what exactly had been said, and Gil had repeated what he remembered, and Amos had said thank you and gone inside. And that night he had sat at his kitchen table with a kerosene lamp and his father's debt documents, and the accounts he had been keeping for 2 years, and he had worked through the numbers for 4 hours. The arithmetic was merciless. If he paid off the remaining $340 he owed Stein, he would have nothing left for Anna's situation. If he kept his money and let the foreclosure proceed, he would eliminate his own debt but lose the neighbor whose fence line he had spent the last year finding reasons to walk slowly past. If he found a third way, some other source of capital, he might be able to address both problems. The third way took him 2 weeks to find, because he was not a man who acted before he had considered every consequence, and because what he was considering was enormous. The Wallace land was his father's land, his grandfather's land, the soil that the family had broken and planted and grieved and built on. Selling half of it was not simply a financial transaction. It was a kind of amputation. But the 240 acres along the river were the most valuable parcel precisely because they were the most fertile, and they would bring a price at public auction sufficient to clear his debt to Stein and provide enough beyond that to cover Anna Pritchard's mortgage balance entirely, with enough remaining that Anna would have a small reserve going into the fall. He made the decision alone, on a hot night in July, sitting on his porch watching lightning flicker on the southern horizon, and once it was made, he did not revisit it. He contacted Gerald Stein the following morning and informed him that the debt would be paid in full within 30 days. Stein, who had never expected full payment and had been quietly prepared to extend his collection timeline indefinitely as long as interest kept accumulating, expressed satisfaction and provided the final accounting. Amos then arranged with the Hayes City Land Registry to list the western parcel for public auction, engaged a surveyor to confirm the lot lines and title, and drafted the consent form in his own hand, signing it without ceremony. He then went to the Hayes City First National Bank and made a payment arrangement with the bank's new manager, a tight-lipped cent. Louis man named Clarence Duval, that would clear the Pritchard mortgage balance in full pending the receipt of auction proceeds. He told Duval that the payment was coming from a third-party settlement of an old account, which was technically not false, and he asked Duval not to disclose the source. Duval, who cared about balances and not backstories, agreed without interest. And then Amos went home, and that night he wrote the note that Anna would find beneath her back door the following morning. Don't worry. It will be handled. He did not sign it with his name. He signed it with nothing at all. The note had nearly undone her. In the privacy of her own kitchen at 5 in the morning with the lamp lit and the rest of the world still dark. She had read it 3 times and had felt a complicated surge of emotion she could not entirely parse, relief tangled with suspicion, tangled with something that felt uncomfortably like being seen by someone who should not know enough to see her. She had shown it to her father, who had read it and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Someone with resources and a reason." "That could be anyone," Anna had said. "It could be," Daniel had agreed, in a tone that suggested it wasn't. Anna had been trying to determine the source for 3 weeks when she arrived at the auction and saw the sign. She stood now at the edge of the crowd with the sound of the bidding in her ears, and the knowledge of what Amos had done settling over her like the kind of rain that starts quietly and then becomes something you cannot ignore, and she felt things she did not have clean words for. Gratitude so large it hurt. Anger at not being told. Something that was neither anger nor gratitude but was bigger than both. She turned from the auction and walked directly to the Wallace property. Amos was in his north field when she came through the gate, working alone along a fence row with a hammer and a bucket of staples, resecuring loose wire. He heard her coming before he saw her, because the prairie was flat and her footsteps on dry ground were audible at 50 yards. He set down the hammer and turned and looked at her with those dark, calm eyes, and she could see immediately that he had been expecting this. That made it worse somehow. "You are auctioning your land," she said when she was close enough that she did not have to raise her voice. "I am," he said, "the western parcel, the river land." "Yes. For how much?" It was not a question the way she said it. He answered it anyway. "It will bring between 500 and 600, I expect, possibly more." She stared at him. "And you are doing this to pay off your father's debt to Stein." Something shifted in his face at that very slightly, and she understood that she had found a secret he had not expected her to find. "How do you know about Stein?" he said, and his voice was quiet but not entirely steady. "I don't," she said. "Or I didn't until just now when you confirmed it." He exhaled through his nose and she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. "That was cleverly done," he said, and there was no irony in it, only what sounded like genuine acknowledgement. "You paid my mortgage," she said. "You are selling half your land to pay your father's debt and my mortgage, and you left me a note with no name on it, and you said nothing." "The mortgage will be covered by the time the auction closes this afternoon," he said. "You should have your title clear before the end of the week." The precision of it, the practical plainness of it, broke something open in her that she had been holding closed. "Amos," she said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way she had not intended and would have been mortified about if she had been capable of being mortified about anything at that moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in those dark eyes that she had been watching for more than a year and learning to read, and he said, "Because you would have refused." "Yes," she said, immediately and honestly. "I would have." "I know," he said. They stood in the heat of the north field with the sound of grasshoppers and the distant echo of the auction carrying on the wind, and the weight of what he had done was between them like a living thing. "You had no right to make that decision for me," she said. "My pride is my own business." "Your pride is your own business," he agreed. "Your farm is another matter. And what gives you the authority to make it your matter?" He turned away from her and looked out over the field for a moment, and she could see the deliberateness with which he was choosing his next words, and that deliberateness was both maddening and deeply characteristic. "Nothing gives me that authority," he said finally, turning back to face her. "I did it anyway. I expect if you want to be angry at me, you have a right to it." She looked at him. She thought about her father's white face when the bank notice came. She thought about the silver hairbrush set that had been her mother's. She thought about 3 sleepless nights and $165 she could not find. "I don't want to be angry at you," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. The look on his face when she said that was not triumph or satisfaction. It was something quieter and more unguarded, something she had not seen there before, and it frightened her a little with how much she recognized it. She left him in the field and walked back to her own land with her thoughts in disarray. She told her father that evening. Not everything, but enough. She told him about the auction and the Wallace land and the note, and Daniel Pritchard listened without interrupting and then sat in silence for a while, and finally said, "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Anna," her father said gently, "what do you feel about Amos Wallace?" She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The window was open and the late summer air came through it carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been feeling a great deal about Amos Wallace for quite some time, and I have been extremely unsuccessful at not feeling it." Daniel Pritchard made a small sound that in another man might have been a laugh. "That's honest," he said. "I am trying to be," she said. The next morning, Anna did something she had never done before in their entire history as neighbors. She went to the Wallace farmhouse and knocked on the door. Gil Burrows opened it and told her Amos was in the barn, and she walked around to the barn and found him doing what he did most mornings, tending to the horses before the day's work began. He had 4 horses, a draft pair and 2 riding horses, and he was brushing down the larger of the riding horses when she came in through the open barn door. He looked up when her shadow fell across the straw, but he did not stop brushing. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She stood in the barn doorway and folded her arms and looked at him and decided that since she had already abandoned her dignity to the wind yesterday, she might as well see it through. "I have been thinking." "About what?" he said. "About what you did," she said. "About what it means that you did it." He kept brushing the horse. The animal stood placidly, large and warm in the morning light, and the sound of the brush on its coat was the only sound for a moment. "What does it mean?" he said finally. "It means," she said, "that you were willing to sacrifice half your inheritance for a woman you have never so much as acknowledged caring about." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have not been entirely honest in my not acknowledging it," he said. Her heart did something involuntary and inconvenient. "Neither have I," she said. He set down the brush and turned to face her fully, and in the morning light of the barn with the horses warm and patient around them, she could see his face clearly, all the things it usually kept guarded and the things that were not guarded now. "I did not do it to purchase anything from you," he said. "Not gratitude, not obligation, not any kind of feeling you don't already have. I did it because the thought of you losing that farm was something I was not able to sit still with. That's all." "That is not all," she said. "Amos, you sold the river land. Your grandfather cleared that ground." "I know what I sold," he said quietly, "and I know why." She uncrossed her arms and took a step toward him, and he watched her come with that still, deliberate attention that she had spent a year finding reasons to encounter, and she stopped when there were 3 feet between them. "I want to pay you back," she said. "I will find a way. You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," she said, "which is precisely the problem." He looked at her for a long time. "What would you consider fair payment?" he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was careful and careful and careful. "I would consider," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, "an honest conversation about what this last year has been for both of us." He exhaled slowly. "That would be fair," he said. They stood in the barn, and the morning moved around them, and the horses shifted and breathed, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched long and still. "I have been watching you since the spring of last year," he said finally. "Not in a way I thought was useful to either of us to name. You are capable and certain, and you do not ask for anything from anyone, and I found all of it," he paused, choosing. "Remarkable." "I have been watching you considerably longer than that," she said, "but I understand the not naming it. I am familiar with the strategy of not naming things." "Does it ever work?" he said. "No," she said, "not at all." The corner of his mouth moved just barely, and she understood that Amos Wallace had a sense of humor that was almost entirely invisible most of the time, and that she was going to spend a significant portion of her remaining life trying to make it surface. That thought arrived in her with the certainty of something long known and newly acknowledged. They did not declare anything that morning in the barn. They were both too careful, too particular about words, for declarations made before things were fully understood. But they talked for an hour about things they had not talked about: the death of his father and what it had cost him, the loneliness of running the Pritchard farm after her mother died, and before she had grown old enough to be useful, the particular weight of responsibility in a country where there was no one to hand that weight to. And when she left to go back to her own land, he walked her to the fence line, which was not something he had ever done before, and when she climbed through the gap in the wire, she turned and said, "Come to supper on Sunday." He said, "I'll be there," without a single moment's hesitation. Daniel Pritchard made the supper himself, despite his ribs, and set the table with the good cloth that had come from Ohio, and said absolutely nothing pointed to either of them all evening, which was one of the greatest acts of restraint that Anna had ever witnessed from a parent. The conversation over supper was about practical things, the fall harvest outlook, the railroad spur that had been proposed for Ellis County, the new water tower being constructed at the edge of Hays City. But underneath all of it was the other conversation, the one conducted in the length of a glance held half a second too long or a sentence turned toward the other person and not the room. And Anna watched her father not watching them and felt something that was close to happiness, which was a feeling she had not been sure she was entitled to while the farm had been at risk. After supper, Amos helped clear the table and then said good night to Daniel with the directness and respect that she was learning to recognize as part of how he moved through the world. And then Anna walked him out to the porch, and they stood in the August evening with the stars enormous and the grasshoppers singing in the dark fields. "Your father cooked that roast with a broken wrist," Amos said. "He is stubborn," Anna said. "He is pleased," Amos said. She looked at him. Pleased about what? He looked back at her with the gravity she had always found both challenging and compelling. "About the direction things appear to be going," he said. "And what direction is that?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. "Toward something neither of us has been willing to say out loud yet," he said, "but which I suspect we are both reasonably certain about." She turned toward him on the porch, and the lamp light from the window fell across his face, and she said, "I am certain about it." "So am I," he said. And it was not a kiss. Not yet, because neither of them was a person who did things before they were ready to do them fully. But he reached out and took her hand, the rough and careful hand of a man who worked in fields, and held it in both of his for a moment, and that gesture contained more than most declarations she had ever heard. September came and the wheat came with it, and they harvested both farms in the same week, combining their labor forces, Gil and Pete and two seasonal men working alongside Anna and her slowly recovering father. Amos directing operations with the calm efficiency that characterized everything he did, and Anna working the grain elevator controls beside him and learning that they had a particular rhythm together. An instinctive sense of each other's movements and needs that made the work go faster than it had any right to. The nights after harvest days were long and tired and good. They sat on porches and ate cold food and talked, sometimes with Daniel joining them, sometimes with Gil and Pete in their easy, weathered company, and sometimes alone, just the two of them in the dark with the sound of the prairie settling around them. It was in one of those conversations, in late September when the nights were getting their first edge of cold, that Amos told her about Gerald Stein. He told her all of it. The locked tin box in his father's trunk, the predatory loan terms, the 2 years of silent repayment, the way the discovery of his father's hidden debt had shadowed everything he had built on that land. "I was angry at him," Amos said about his father, "for a long time. It felt like a betrayal not just of me but of the land itself, like everything I thought was solid had a rotten beam under it. But you paid the debt," she said. "It was not his debt to me," he said. "It was a debt the land carried. I couldn't leave it there." She thought about that. "And the western parcel," she said quietly. "Did it hurt to let it go?" He was honest the way he always was. "Yes," he said, "it did." She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his, the way he had done for her on the porch in August, and he turned his hand over and held hers. "We will plant along that river boundary next spring," she said. "Our boundary and yours. We'll put wheat along the whole fence line and it will all reach the same grain elevator and it won't matter which side of the line it came from." He looked at her and the expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Is that a proposal?" he said, and his voice was quiet and serious with the smallest possible light underneath. "It is a farming suggestion," she said, equally seriously. "I see," he said. A pause. "Although," she said. "Although," he agreed, and there was that barely visible fraction of a smile. She was not a woman given to grand gestures or florid language. She was practical and direct, and she had spent most of her life pruning sentiment into usefulness. But she had also spent a year watching Amos Wallace, and she knew what she knew. "I love you," she said plainly, the way she would have said that the fence needs mending or the north well is running low. Simply because it was simply true. He looked at her in the dark, and the stars were overhead and the September chill was in the air, and he said, "I love you, Anna. I have loved you for a long time without knowing a decent way to say it." "This is a decent way," she said. "Better than a note with no name on it," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, and he watched her laugh with a look on his face that made her understand that she was in possession of something very rare, the undivided attention of a man who did not give it easily and who would not take it back. He asked her father for permission to court her formally the following week, in the kitchen of the Pritchard farmhouse over coffee, with a directness and seriousness that made Daniel Pritchard, who was not a man easily moved, have to look out the window for a moment before he answered. He answered yes. The courtship was brief by some measures and exactly the right length by others. It was 2 months of Sunday suppers and long evenings and rides along the Smoky Hill River on horseback, through the copper-end gold fall country, and conversations that went where they needed to go, into the difficult places and the tender ones, into plans and histories and fears, and all the ordinary architecture of 2 lives considering how to become one life. Amos proposed on a cold November evening on the Pritchard front porch, not with speeches or flourish, but with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he held out to her in his work-roughened hand and said, "Anna Pritchard, I would like very much to spend my life with you if you are willing." She looked at the ring and at his face and at the breath clouding in the cold air between them and said, "I am willing. I am extremely willing." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, and then she stepped forward and kissed him, her hands against the front of his coat, and it was a real kiss, unhurried and deliberate, the kind that has the full weight of 2 people behind it. The wedding was on a Saturday in late January of 1875, in the small Methodist church in Hays City, with the congregation that had gathered to celebrate being composed of neighbors and farm hands and the minister's family, and a number of Hays City residents who had come partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of the particular prairie curiosity that attends any community event. Daniel Pritchard, whose ribs had healed and whose wrist was nearly fully restored, walked his daughter down the aisle with his chin up and his eyes very bright. Anna wore her mother's dress, altered at the seams by a seamstress in town named Mrs. Clara Marsh, the same widow woman to whom Amos had once sent firewood without being asked. Mrs. Marsh had done the alterations with great care and had refused payment, which had made Anna both grateful and determined to find some other way to repay the kindness. Amos stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that fit him well and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was not performance, was not what people wore at weddings because they were supposed to, but was the particular look of a man who is being confronted with the reality of something he has wanted very much and is discovering that the reality is better than the wanting. The minister performed the ceremony with warmth and without unnecessary length, which was exactly right. The vows were the traditional ones, the ones that had been said in that church and every church like it across the country, but when Amos said them, they did not sound like recitation. They sounded like a decision, carefully made and fully meant. When he said, "I do," it was in the same tone as everything else he said, direct, certain, and without any qualifier. She said them back to him and felt the full weight of what they were, not just words but architecture, the beginning of a structure they were going to build together. They kissed in the church, and the congregation applauded with the warmth of people who have watched 2 good people find each other after considerable effort. And Daniel Pritchard sat in the front pew with his hands clasped, and his expression one of complete peace. The reception afterward was held in the Grange Hall, with food brought by neighbors and fiddle music provided by a young man named Tommy Hale, who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but made up for it in energy. And there was dancing that lasted until 10 o'clock and apple cider, and enough food to feed the county. Anna danced with her father and with Gil Burrows, who was a surprisingly good dancer for a man of such large boots, and with the minister's son, and then she danced with Amos. And dancing with Amos was different from dancing with anyone else, not because he was especially skilled, though he was competent, but because of the particular quality of his attention, which was entirely and only on her, and she found that she could no longer be casually surprised by it. "Are you happy?" he said to her quietly while they were dancing, and it was a genuine question, not a pleasantry. "Extremely," she said, and meant it in all its dimensions. "Good," he said, with the simplicity of a man who has been worrying about a specific thing and is relieved to have a clear answer. They went home that night to the Wallace farmhouse, which was now their home together, and Anna stood in the kitchen that she had never been inside before and looked at the plain, solid furniture and the well-maintained stove and the shelves of carefully kept accounts ledgers, and she felt the distinct sensation of a life clicking into the shape it had always been meant to have. "It needs curtains," she said. "I have never cared about curtains," Amos said from the doorway. "You are about to start," she said. He looked at her with that barely there smile and said, "I expect you're right." She made the curtains herself over the course of the following week, from blue cotton fabric she bought at the general store in Hay City, and she hung them in the kitchen windows in the front room, and Amos looked at them without comment for 2 days and then told her one evening that the kitchen looked better. "Of course it does," she said. "I'm not going to argue with you about curtains," he said. "That is very wise," she said. Winter passed, and the spring of 1875 came in with a warmth that felt like a confirmation of something, and they planted along the fence line exactly as Anna had described the previous autumn, wheat running the length of the boundary between the Wallace land and the Pritchard land, which Daniel still worked on the southern side with the help of a young man from town who was learning farming. It had been decided, in one of those conversations that married people have early in their marriages that shape everything afterward, that the Pritchard farm would continue to operate as a separate but allied operation, with Daniel managing what he could manage and Anna and Amos providing support, labor, and resources as needed. It was a sensible arrangement that respected Daniel's dignity and his attachment to the land he had worked for 13 years, and it suited everyone. Gerald Stein, whose debt had been fully paid with the auction proceeds, had made a point of coming to find Amos after the sale to tell him that he had not expected to be fully paid and that he respected the settlement of the account. Amos had received this with polite brevity and had not seen Stein again. The bank manager Duval had returned to St. Louis after 18 months in Hayes City, replaced by a local man named Henry Farber, who was considerably more interested in the community's long-term welfare and considerably less interested in quick foreclosures. The western 240 acres of the Wallace property had been purchased at auction by a man named Thomas Quill, a homesteader from Indiana who brought his wife and 3 children to Kansas and established a working farm on the river land within the year. The Quills became good neighbors, the kind of people who showed up when there was trouble and brought food when there was celebration, and Anna liked Thomas Quill's wife Eliza enormously, finding in her a particular kind of friendship that women on the prairie built quickly and maintained with practical love. The summer of 1875 was a good one for wheat, and the harvest was the best Anna had managed in 3 years, and she stood at the grain elevator and watched the numbers go down in the ledger, and felt the uncomplicated satisfaction of a year going right. In August of 1875, she told Amos that they were going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen, over the breakfast dishes, with the same directness and plainness that characterized her communication about everything, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes, and then stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that she recognized, after 9 months of marriage. As the particular unguarded look that Amos Wallace kept very carefully hidden from the world and showed only to her. "A baby," he said. "That is the implication, yes," she said. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, her mouth, carefully and with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and then he held her against him in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the blue curtains, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I feel excellent. Please don't start treating me like I am fragile." "I would not dream of it," he said. "Good," she said, "because I have a south fence line to walk this morning." "I'll walk it with you," he said. Daniel Pritchard, when told, sat in his kitchen chair and covered his face with his hands for a moment in the way of a man who is feeling something large, and then looked up at his daughter with eyes that were bright and said, "Your mother would have been so happy." "I know," Anna said, and took his hand. The autumn of 1875 was soft and gold, and Anna continued to work the farm through her pregnancy with the stubbornness that everyone who knew her had come to accept as a permanent feature, modifying what needed to be modified but refusing to stop doing what she could do. Amos adapted around her with a quiet attentiveness that was so entirely characteristic of him that it seemed less like accommodation and more like the natural operation of someone who simply paid attention to the person he loved. He was there on the December night the baby came, the winter cold pressing against the house while Mrs. Eliza Quill and the midwife attended Anna, and he sat in the kitchen with Daniel and did not speak for several hours except once, when he said to Daniel quietly, "She is the strongest person I have ever known," and Daniel said, "Yes, she is." The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and loud and entirely healthy, and when the midwife brought him out to show his father, Amos took the small, furious bundle with the careful hands of a man who is holding something irreplaceable, and looked down at the boy's face for a long time without speaking. When Anna asked him what he was thinking, from the bed where she was exhausted and shining with the particular exhausted radiance of new mothers, he looked up at her and said, "That I didn't know it was possible to love two people this completely." She laughed, even though laughing after 12 hours of labor was not comfortable, and said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed with the baby between them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the December wind moved around the house and the fire crackled, and Daniel Pritchard, who was sitting in the front room and pretending very earnestly to read his Bible, was absolutely not weeping. They named the boy Daniel Caleb Wallace for both grandfathers, which was Anna's idea and which Amos received with a stillness that she had learned to recognize as the particular silence that comes before a man feels something he was not prepared to feel. "Caleb," he said. "Your father's name is on this land," she said. "I think it belongs in this family too, even with everything complicated about it. He was a man who made mistakes, but he built something real." Amos looked at her for a long time. "You are a remarkable person," he said, which for Amos Wallace was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. "I know," she said, which made him make that barely visible smile that she collected like other women collected china. Young Daniel, called Danny in the casual shorthand of daily life, grew as children on the Kansas prairie grew, quickly, and with a direct relationship to the land and the seasons that the frontier imposed on every life. He was a sturdy, curious, dark-eyed child who followed his father around the farm with the complete seriousness of a small person who intends to understand everything, and who climbed into his mother's lap in the evenings with the equally complete seriousness of a person who knows exactly where comfort lives. By the spring of 1877, the Wallace farm was in the best condition it had been in since before Caleb's death. The debt to Stein was a closed chapter. The Pritchard farm was stable and productive. The fence lines were well maintained. The relationship between the Wallace land and the Quill land, their new western neighbors, was easy and mutual and good. And Anna and Amos had built between them, through 2 years of marriage, something that people who watched it from the outside could not always find the exact words for. A partnership so fundamental that it had become difficult to think of either of them as separate from the other, not because either had disappeared into the other, but because they had each become more fully themselves in proximity to the other person. She was still direct and capable and occasionally formidable. He was still quiet and deliberate and nearly impossible to read until you learned to read him, and then entirely transparent to the person who had done that work. They argued sometimes, because they were both strong-willed and both right with enough frequency that the distinction between right and wrong was sometimes genuinely unclear. And when they argued honestly and without spite, and they generally resolved their arguments through the same mechanism that resolved most things between them: careful honesty and a willingness to say what they actually meant. It was Amos who raised, one spring evening in 1877, the subject that Anna had been carrying privately. They were on the porch after Danny was asleep, the spring air warm enough to be pleasant, and he said, without any particular preamble, "You have been thinking about something for the past 2 weeks." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "You do a particular thing with your coffee cup in the evenings when you are thinking about something you haven't decided whether to say," he said. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands and then back at him. "That is alarming," she said, "that you can read me like that." "Moderately," he agreed. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the western parcel." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I have been thinking that if we offered the Quills a fair price for it, they might sell. They've been talking about moving north toward the Saline River. Thomas mentioned it to me last month. Their oldest boy is getting married and the family wants more land and they want to consolidate it in one place." Amos was very still. "The auction prices 2 years ago were high," she said. "I have been putting aside money since we married. My share of the harvest sales. I have $400 saved." "Anna," he said. "It is mine to use as I choose," she said, "and I choose this." "That is $400, he said. "Thomas paid $370 at the auction," she said. "He would want a profit, but I think he would sell at $450 if we negotiated well and if the terms were right, because he wants to move on and a quick, clean sale is better for him than a slow, profitable one." Amos sat with this for a long time. She waited. She had learned that the length of his silences was proportional to the size of what he was feeling, and this silence was long. "You've done the arithmetic," he said finally. "I have done all the arithmetic," she said. "You want to buy back the river land," he said. "I want to buy back your grandfather's land," she said. "I want Danny to grow up knowing every acre of what his family built." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her in the evening light, and the look on his face was the unguarded one, the one she had been given on very specific occasions over 2 years of marriage, and it was the same look it had always been but larger somehow, as if it had grown with time. "I told you once," he said, "that you didn't owe me anything. And I told you," she said, "that I owed you everything. Anna." "Amos," she said, perfectly mirroring his tone, which made his expression shift into something between exasperation and helpless affection. "You are going to do this regardless of what I say," he said. "I am going to offer it to you as a joint decision," she said, "because we are married and that is how we do things. But yes, I think this is the right thing. I think it very strongly." He looked at her for a moment longer and then he said, "Then let's negotiate with the Quills." The negotiation with Thomas Quill took 3 meetings in 2 weeks and ended at $440, which was $60 less than his asking price and $35 less than Anna had been willing to pay, a fact she did not disclose to either Amos or Thomas, keeping it in the private accounting of a woman who understood that information was a resource to be managed. The papers were signed at the Land Registry Office in Hayes City on a Tuesday in June, and Amos held the deed to the western parcel in his hands afterward and looked at it for a moment on the front steps of the registry building, in the summer heat, with Anna standing beside him and Danny on her hip beginning to lose patience with being held. "Your grandfather broke that ground," Anna said quietly. "He did," Amos said. "It's yours again," she said. He folded the deed carefully, the way he handled all documents, and put it in his inside coat pocket, and then he looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been reading for 4 years now and that still occasionally found new things to show her. "Our grandfather's ground," he said. She felt the warmth of that move through her like sunlight. "Yes," she said. "Ours." Danny, who had at this moment lost all patience with standing still on the steps of the land registry, said emphatically, and without ambiguity, that he wanted down, and Amos took him from Anna's arms and set him on his shoulders, which Danny found entirely satisfactory, and they walked down the main street of Hayes City in the June morning, the three of them together, with the deed to the Wallace land whole again in Amos's coat pocket. The summer of 1877 was abundant in ways that felt earned. The wheat came in heavy and clean. The prices at the grain elevator were the best in several years, and the relationship between the Wallace and Pritchard operations had matured into a model of mutual support that made both farms stronger than they would have been separately. Daniel Pritchard had recovered fully from his injuries and was working his farm with the help of a young hired man named Joel, who was teaching himself to read in the evenings using Anna's old primers, and who had the makings of a good farmer and possibly a good reader too. Daniel had also, somewhat to everyone's quiet delight, developed a warm friendship with Clara Marsh, the widow woman from 2 miles north, which had begun over a shared interest in seed catalogs and had evolved, with the complete serenity of two people in their 50s who have no patience for pretense, into something that appeared to make them both quite happy. Anna watched this development with a warm amusement that she shared with Amos in private, and he made his characteristically understated comments about how it was gratifying when people found what they were looking for, and she said that she found it remarkable how he always managed to say the most feeling things in the plainest possible language. And he said he found it remarkable that she always managed to make him aware of things he had not been sufficiently aware of. And they agreed that they complemented each other admirably. That fall, Anna told him she was pregnant again. She told him at the breakfast table, as she had the first time, over the morning coffee, with the same directness. He looked at her with the same long, particular look, and then he smiled, which was not the barely visible fraction of a smile she collected, but an actual real complete smile that she had seen perhaps 6 times in their years together, and that still produced an involuntary physical response somewhere in her chest. "Good," he said, in the tone of a man for whom that word contains a great deal. "I thought you'd be pleased," she said. "I am extremely pleased," he said with a gravity that was entirely sincere. "You smiled," she said. "I smile," he said. "With your whole face," she said. "That's a rare thing. You bring it out," he said simply. This time it was a girl, born in the spring of 1878, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular expression of concentrated assessment, a face that seemed, from the first days of her life, to be evaluating everything it encountered and drawing careful conclusions. They named her Mary Ruth Wallace, Mary for a grandmother on the Pritchard side, and Ruth because Anna had always loved the Book of Ruth for its plain-spoken commitment, and because the story of a woman saying to another person, "I will go where you go, and your people will be my people," had always seemed to her one of the most honest and uncomplicated descriptions of love she had ever encountered. Amos held Mary Ruth on the first evening, sitting in the kitchen chair while Anna rested, Danny asleep in his room, the house quiet in the way of houses where something has just arrived that will change everything. And he looked down at his daughter's face with the same expression he had worn looking at his son 3 years earlier, the full, unguarded, irreversible look of a man encountering the complete scale of what he loves. He looked up at Anna, who was watching him from the bed in the next room through the open door, and said nothing, because there were no words that improved on what was already in the room, but his face said everything, and she read it as easily as she read the weather and the wheat and the fence lines and all the other legible things of her life. She smiled at him, the full real smile that she did not reserve as he reserved his, but that had a particular quality when it was directed at him, something that was warm and certain and without any reservation at all. He smiled back. By 1880, the Wallace farm was 360 acres of fully integrated, productively managed Kansas prairie farmland, restored to its original boundaries, and operating with a clarity and purpose that reflected the people running it. Amos had added a second grain storage building and upgraded the horse barn, which was now capable of housing 8 animals. Anna had established a kitchen garden and a small poultry operation that generated a consistent supplemental income and supplied eggs and chickens to 2 of the Hayes City boarding houses. Danny, who was 4 years old, had become the farm's most enthusiastic, if least competent laborer, assisting with everything from gathering eggs to feeding the horses, and providing a running commentary on all proceedings that Amos answered with his characteristic patience, and that Anna answered with her characteristic combination of patience and directness. Mary Ruth, a year and a half old, was at the stage of development where she followed her brother everywhere he went with absolute determination and the slightly unsteady gait of a new walker, and Danny, who had initially been uncertain about the arrival of a sibling, had by this point fully accepted his role as her guide and protector, a role he took with a seriousness that was entirely characteristic of the Wallace family in general. Daniel Pritchard had married Clara Marsh in a quiet ceremony at the end of 1878, which had made both of them visibly and unself-consciously happy, and they had combined their 2 households on Clara's farm, leasing the Pritchard land to Joel, who had indeed become a competent farmer and a competent reader. Daniel came to the Wallace farm every Sunday and sat on the porch and watched his grandchildren with an expression of complete contentment that Anna considered among the most beautiful things she had ever seen. The secret that had started everything, the auction, the note, the hidden sacrifice, had long since ceased to be a secret in any meaningful sense. The community of Ellis County, which was small enough that things were eventually known, had pieced it together over the years, and the story of Amos Wallace auctioning half his land to save the Pritchard farm, and never saying a word about it, had taken on the quality of local legend, the kind that gets embellished in the telling at the grain elevator and the general store, but that retains its essential truth. People said it made sense, knowing both of them. People said that it was the most Amos Wallace thing anyone had ever heard of. People said that it was the kind of thing you did when you loved someone, when you loved them before you had said so, when the feeling was bigger than the words had yet become. Anna had overheard 2 women discussing it at the general store one afternoon in 1879, had stood in the dry goods aisle listening with her back to them and a bolt of calico in her hands, and had felt something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite pride but was somewhere between them, the feeling of being known in public in a way that was accurate to the most private truth. She had told Amos that evening, and he had listened, and then he had said, "What did they get wrong?" "They had the amount of the debt slightly inflated," she said, "and they thought you had been in love with me since before the fence dispute, which may or may not be accurate." He considered this. "The fence dispute was March of 1873, he said. "Yes. I had been paying attention to you since the winter of 1872, he said, with the precision of a man who keeps accurate records. She looked at him. "That's more than a year before you fixed my fence." "I was not ready to do anything about it in the winter of 1872, he said. "But you were ready to auction half your land," she said. "By that point," he said, "yes, considerably." She leaned her head against his shoulder on the porch where they were sitting, and felt the weight and warmth of him beside her, and the evening air, and the sound of their children's voices from inside the house. And she thought about the sequence of it all, the fence and the coffee and the long evenings, and the note with no name on it, and the ring on her finger and the deed in his coat pocket, and the 2 dark-eyed children in the house, and the way all of it had moved with the logic of a thing that was always going to happen. finding its way through every obstacle toward the shape it had been meant to be. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said, in the tone of a man who is prepared for any scale of conversation. "When I found out what you had done," she said, "at the auction that morning, what I felt was the most complicated thing I have ever felt. I was angry and grateful and overwhelmed, and I felt seen, and I felt crowded at the same time, which I know is contradictory." "It's not contradictory," he said. "But underneath all of it," she said, "underneath every complicated layer, what I felt most was that I had been loved by someone who understood me, who knew that I would refuse if asked, who knew me well enough to know that the only way to help me was to help me without my permission, because my pride would have stopped me from accepting what I needed." He was quiet. "I have thought about that a great many times," she said, "because it says something about you that I don't think I could have discovered any other way, that you understood me that well, that early, before any of this." He put his arm around her on the porch, and she felt the familiar solid weight of it. "I have known you a long time," he said. "You have," she said, "and I have known you, and I think we were very fortunate that we were paying attention." "I was always paying attention," he said quietly. She tilted her head up to look at him in the evening light. This man she had married for every right reason, this quiet and deliberate and deeply loyal person who had sold his grandfather's land for her before she had any idea he would, and she said, "I know, I was too. We just needed a fence dispute." The corner of his mouth moved, and she watched it become the full smile, the real one, that she still found extraordinary, and she kissed him on the cheek and then settled back against his shoulder. The stars came out over Kansas, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the fire was warm inside the house and their children were sleeping. And Daniel Pritchard was at his own home 5 miles away, content and cared for, and the Wallace land was whole and prosperous and in good hands. 3 years had been enough to turn a forbidden sacrifice into the foundation of a life. 3 years had been enough to turn a note with no name into a marriage, a family, a shared set of fields under the same enormous Kansas sky. By the fall of 1880, when Anna told Amos, once again over the morning coffee, with the same directness and the same plain delivery, that they were expecting a third child, he set down his coffee cup for the third time in this particular ritual of their life together, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that had never once, in all the years she had been reading them, told her anything other than the complete unguarded truth, and he said, "3." "3," she confirmed. "Are you well?" he said. "I am," she said. "I am extremely well." He reached across the table and took her hand, and Danny, who was 5 now and entirely alert to everything that happened in the kitchen, said from his chair with biscuit crumbs on his face, "What is it?" "You are going to have a brother or a sister," his mother said. Danny considered this with the focused seriousness of a 5-year-old evaluating a new development. "Which one?" he said. "We don't know yet," his father said. "I would like a brother," Danny said. "I'll see what I can do," Anna said with complete seriousness. The third child arrived in the spring of 1881, another boy, born on a bright April morning when the prairie was greening up, and the wheat was 3 inches high, and the whole wide Kansas country was stretching itself awake after the winter. They named him Eli James Wallace, Eli because it was strong and clean-sounding, and both of them liked it, and James for Amos's uncle who had served in the war and come home and lived quietly and done good work, which seemed like a fine legacy to carry. Danny, who had gotten his wish, accepted the role of eldest brother with the gravity of a child who understood that responsibility was a serious business, and Mary Ruth, who was 3 and entirely in charge of most situations she found herself in, examined the new arrival with the considered assessment that was her characteristic expression and determined, apparently, that he would do. And Amos and Anna, standing in the bedroom doorway while the midwife cleaned up, and the children argued cheerfully in the front room about what the baby would be able to do and how soon, looked at each other over the heads of the world they had built, and nothing needed to be said, because they were both reading it clearly, the farm and the family and the recovered land, and the 6 years of mornings and evenings that had moved through them like seasons, accumulating into something that bore no resemblance to the two separate and careful people they had been. He crossed the doorway to stand beside her, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. And outside the window the Kansas spring was doing what it did, indifferently and magnificently, and without any regard for the human lives playing out beneath its enormous sky. And inside the window, inside the warmth of a farmhouse on recovered land, those human lives were doing what they did in return, finding each other and holding on and building, carefully, the things worth building. The note had said, "Don't worry, it will be handled." It had been handled. All of it, the debt and the fear and the pride and the loneliness and the farm that almost wasn't, all of it had been handled, not because one person had saved another in a single dramatic moment, though that moment had certainly existed and had certainly mattered, but because two people had paid attention to each other, had told the truth when it was difficult, had made their sacrifices without expectation and their declarations without flourish, and had shown up every morning to the same fields and the same fence lines and the same person beside them. That, Anna thought, was what the note had really meant. Not just that the mortgage would be paid, not just that the farm would be saved, but that there was a person in the world who would quietly, without announcement, without asking anything in return, do the thing that needed doing because he loved her before he had the words for it. And she had found him at the end of a fence line in the spring, and brought him coffee on a porch in the summer, and listened to him talk in the fall evenings, and married him in January cold, and worked his land with him through 4 harvests, and given him 3 children who would grow up knowing that this land had been worth everything it had cost, worth every dollar auctioned off along the Smoky Hill River, worth every word that had not been said, worth every quiet, unclaimed, perfectly deliberate act of love.